By sunset, the capital looked most beautiful on the night it decided to bury its gods. Lanterns burned along the upper terraces in several imperial colors. Brass bells shone from every bridge. Children leaned from windows to watch the procession move toward the central hill, where priests who had not been arrested yet sang approved hymns in voices too careful to sound afraid. Flower sellers called the night of deliverance. Soldiers called it the last defense. The court bulletins called it the Great Chaining, because empires preferred honest words when they believed history would thank them. Aren Vale crossed the upper threshold yard with the alignment case under one arm and his work badge cold against his throat. Below his boots, chain lifts descended into the underworks. They were not cages. The engineers had been told never to call them cages. They were transit frames, load-bearing descent platforms. Imperial rated for 30 men, or 12 tons of threshold plate. They were bronze railings, numbered anchors, and inspection seals from 3 departments. They looked like infrastructure if a person was trained not to ask why every link had been blessed, salted, and stamped, with names scraped from conquered temples. Aren had inspected most of them. That was the trouble with guilt. It was easier to bear when it had measurements. A girl on the terrace above threw white petals into the yard. They fell around the engineers like soft ash. One landed on Aren's sleeve, and for a moment he remembered his Aunt Leora, brushing flour from his coat when he was 12. The night she first showed him the hidden ledger page and made him swear never to trust an empire that filed a god under utilities. He had laughed then because he was 12 and the empire paid for his schooling. He was not laughing now. A horn sounded from the eastern gate. The first chain lift opened. Aren looked up at the city. Lit windows, crowded balconies, laundries steaming in the last light, hospitals glowing clean and white, water towers turning stolen tide into pressure, transit arches carrying families home before curfew, and hated how much of it deserved to survive. That was the first hook the Empire set into decent men. It made the crime useful. Aren should have gone straight below. Instead, he took the north stairs to the family rooms behind the old register annex, where the name Vale still opened one locked door the Empire had forgotten to reclaim. The rooms were narrow, dusty, and unimportant by any official standard. 3 generations of Vales had lived there, while serving as clerks, junior registers, bridge counters, death witnesses, and finally threshold engineers. The Empire liked useful families. It fed them, promoted them, gave their children technical educations, and called loyalty a virtue when debt would have been a cleaner word. Aren opened the false panel behind the cold stove. Inside lay the family inheritance, a black ledger fragment wrapped in a linen, a bone-white diagnostic strip with Miren Calis's seal cracked down the middle, and a copied page so old the ink had sunk into the fiber like a bruise. Disputed. The word survived flood, fire, promotion, inspection, and 3 relatives practical enough to hide truth without being brave enough to use it. Aren touched the page with 2 fingers. The ink didn't move. It had moved for Sera Venn. That was what Leora had told him. Sera, who had recorded a death before it had happened, and refused to let the Empire make falsehood lawful. Sera, who had married into the Vale line after the registry house had reorganized and all the surviving records were corrected. Sera, whose name no longer appeared in any official archive except as a copying heir. Aren had built his life inside corrected records. He unfolded Miren's diagnostic strip next. Most of the script was faded, but one line remained sharp enough to cut with. Imprisonment will distribute the wound, not cure it. He had read that line 100 times. Tonight, it stopped being a warning and became instruction. A knock struck the outer door. "Engineer Vale," a guard called. "The Empress has entered the threshold yard. All senior aligners are ordered below." Senior aligner. Aren almost smiled. A title was what the Empire gave you when it wanted your hands clean enough to trust and dirty enough to use. He placed Sera's page and Miren's strip inside the inner pocket of his work coat. Then he lifted the ledger fragment. For the first time in his life, the black surfaced, warmed. A single line appeared in ink that had not been there a breath before. Not absent. Aren closed the fragment so fast the hinges bit his thumb. The room went silent. Not quiet, silent, as if something under the world had noticed him noticing. The Empress stood above a map of the world made from brass, chain metal, and bone-white pins. Aren, the first, was smaller than the statues had promised, and more frightening for it. No war crown, no jeweled armor, no theatrical grief. She wore a dark formal coat fastened to the throat, and held a pointer in one gloved hand like any other official about to explain necessary losses. Around her, the final engineering council watched the deep hinge model turn. Aren took his place among the threshold aligners as Chief Architect Volin described the gods in language clean enough to pass through procurement. The Death Authority will be seated through the western hinge, fire through the lower furnace lattice, tide through the pressure wells, root through the foundational braid, memory through the civic archive, shadow, season, storm, birth, and boundary through their assigned receiving structures. All remaining free domains will be drawn through the central descent geometry and stabilized by the bound choir until lock completion. No one said gods, not once. They said authorities, pressures, domains, loads. Aren watched the model doors open and close beneath the city. Each tiny hinge was etched with numbers. Each number corresponded to a corridor he had inspected, a threshold plate he had calibrated, a chain he had signed as load ready. Aren set the pointer down. "You have all heard the forbidden argument," she said, "that what we do tonight is sacrilege, that we stole what should have remained beyond law, that divine retaliation is the price of imperial arrogance." The room held still. Some of that is true. That was the first rehook, though Aren didn't have a word for it. The moment the villain refused to lie and became more dangerous. Aren looked from engineer to engineer. "But innocence is not available to us. The tideworks feed 11 provinces. Fire engines hold the northern front. Restorative root keeps plagues from the lower cities. Death registries prevent succession wars. Memory courts keep treaties from becoming rumor. You may dislike the Foundation. So do I. But if the gods break free tonight, they will not punish only the guilty. They will answer through every gift we forced open. Ordinary people will die first." Aren hated that she had chosen that argument he feared most. "The great chaining is not purity," Aren said. "It's survival. History may condemn us after it has the luxury of existing." Then she looked directly at Aren. Not long, not specially, but enough. "Engineers," she said, "take us below." The chain lift dropped beneath the Capitol with 32 engineers, 6 imperial guards, 3 priest clerks, and 1 silence that didn't belong to any of them. Aren stood near the rail and watched the city disappear into the square of violet evening. First the lanterns, then the terrace arches, then the last bright edge of sky. After came stone, brass ribs, maintenance ruins, pressure pipes, sealed doors, and the old temple foundations the Empire built around instead of admitting they existed. At the first under gallery, a door opened in bare rock. No hinges, no frame, no seam until it was there. Beyond it, black water lapped against steps that descended into moonless sea. One of the younger aligners whispered a prayer, and then remembered too late that prayer was not banned exactly, only professionally unwise. The doors closed. No one wrote it down. They had all learned the first rule of imperial crisis work. An anomaly did not become real until someone filed it badly. The second gallery smelled of cold ash. A furnace channel burned blue-white along the wall, but Aren felt no heat from it. In the glow, a dead worker answered roll call. Merrick Soul, the foreman called. Present, said a voice from an empty hook where a work coat hung. The foreman lowered his slate. Everyone knew Merrick Soul had died 3 days earlier when a threshold pin crushed his chest. His body had been certified, removed, and burned with honors. His widow had signed the receipt. Merrick Soul, the foreman repeated, voice cracking. Present, the empty coat said again, patient as a procedure. Aren's ledger fragment warmed through his pocket, not absent. He understood then that the chaining had not begun at midnight as scheduled. It had begun years ago, in every useful theft, every corrected report, every miracle renamed as public works. Tonight was not the start. Tonight was the Empire tightening what it already had tied. The choir vault had been a temple once. Aren knew it from the proportions before he saw the defaced altar. No engineer designed a chamber with that much useless height unless the original purpose was to make human beings feel small. The Empire had kept the height and improved the drainage. 43 members of the bound choir stood in 2 curved rows beneath the cutaway dome. Some were priests, some were temple mathematicians, some were god servants whose bodies had changed in ways the Empire's tailors tried to hide with gray robes and careful collars. All wore throat rings of chainmetal. Stabilizing cords ran from rings to the central brass loom, where priest clerks checked the tension with surgical delicacy. No blood, no spectacle. That made it worse. The Empire had learned that cruelty looked more legitimate when it was quiet, clean, and supervised. An elder cantor watched Aren approach. His nameplate read Civ Marat, Threshold Stabilization Asset. Aren removed the word asset from the man in his mind and found that it left a hole. Your second ring is misaligned, Aren said. Civ smiled faintly. So is your age. My age? You think you stand at the end of a crisis. You stand at the beginning of a long burial. A guard stepped closer. Aren lifted a hand, pretending professional focus. I need him to speak. Alignment requires responsive testing. The guard stepped back. Civ's voice rasped against the ring. They told you bound gods become safe. That's not the only rule. Aren adjusted the ring latch, buying time with tiny movements. What is the rule? A god forced through a threshold remains in every threshold built from the forcing. Bind passage, and passage remembers the chain. Bind fire, and every hearth learns hunger. Bind root, and foundations dream of taking back what grew from them. Aren thought of hospitals, bridges, courts, roads, nurseries, Register halls. Then there's no clean correction, he said. There was, Civ whispered, before usefulness became worship. The central loom rang once. Every throat ring tightened by a fraction. The choir inhaled together because they had no permission not to. The misalignment was only 3 degrees. That was enough to save Aren's life and ruin what remained of his loyalty. A threshold seam in the western gallery refused to sit flush. It should have joined Death Authority to the deep hinge through a minor receiving corridor. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible to anyone above his rank. Aren knelt with his annotation tool, scraped wax from the seam, and found a black thread wedged behind the plate. Not thread, ledger binding. His hand went cold. Behind the plate was a niche no longer than a bread box. Inside sat a sealed packet wrapped in an old diagnostic cloth and marked with a healer's sign. Miren Calis. Aren knew the name from the family fragment. He knew the line that had survived. He didn't know she had written more. He broke the seal. The report was cramped, hurried, and mercilessly clear. False miracles across domains, death refusing closure, fire consuming memory, tide answering inland, root reclaiming saved flesh, memory speaking through the wrong mouths, a chained patient naming the pattern, Director Saville sealing the truth and replacing it with categories that could be managed. Then the sentence Aren already knew, followed by one he didn't. Imprisonment will distribute the wound, not cure it. If the Empire binds the gods beneath its foundations, the Godscar will become foundational. Aren sat back on his heels. Above him, the capital's pipes hummed. Beneath him, something vast shifted in the dark. A report written by a mother trying to save a child had been hidden in the machine that would bury gods. That was witness, not victory, not rescue, but refusal to let the future inherit only the Empire's explanation. Aren folded the report and placed it against Sera's page inside his coat. The 2 old truths touched. The threshold seemed to click into alignment by itself. Aren received him in the deep-hinged antechamber, where the imperial map showed the capital as a bright circle above a knot of descending chains. Aren expected denial. He wanted denial. Denial would have made defiance simple. Instead, the Empress read Miren's report without changing expression. "This is authentic," she said. Aren felt the last childish part of him break. "You knew." "I suspected. Saville confirmed enough." "Then you knew the chaining won't cure it." "Yes." The word landed harder than any lie. Aren stepped closer before the guards could decide whether his grief counted as a threat. "Then why are we doing it?" Aren looked past him toward the sealed chamber where the bound choir were being led into position. "Because the alternative arrives tonight. Not in theory, not in a century. Tonight. The gods have learned to answer through the wounds we made. Death records are writing ahead. Fire engines are eating names. Tidewells are pulling whole streets into sleep. Root foundations have cracked 3 plague hospitals from below. If the free domains converge under the city, the capital becomes the first grave of a very honest age. And if we bind them, then our descendants inherit a quieter disaster." Aren stared at her. Karen's face held no triumph. That almost made him hate her more. "You call that a choice?" "No," she said. "I call it government." For a moment, Aren saw the true horror of the Empire. Not stupidity, not even greed. A disciplined willingness to choose a future wound over a present collapse and call the arithmetic mercy. "History will know," Aren said. "History will be alive, to resent us, Karen said. That is the only defense I have. The antechamber bell rang 3 times. Midnight had reached the underworld. Doors open where there were no walls. They appeared first as outlines in the air, thin black rectangles standing in corridors, across stairwells through the bodies of brass machines. Then came handles, then thresholds, then the terrible suggestion that every closed thing in the underworks had always been waiting for permission to become passage. An engineer named Pell stepped back through one by accident and returned old, not dead, not harmed in any visible way, only old enough that his beard had gone white and his hand shook around tools he no longer remembered how to use. I was gone a breath, he said. No one answered. A fire channel bloomed along the floor without heat. In its light, Aren saw his own funeral reflected in the brass wall. He saw Leora older than she had lived to be. He saw a child who might have been his, if he had ever trusted the future enough to make one. He saw the capital above, still beautiful, still hungry, every gate shining with a chain buried under the stone. The bound choir began to sing from the next chamber. The sound was not music yet. It was alignment. 43 voices forced into a shape no throat should hold. The doors shuddered. Behind one, seawater climbed upward instead of down. Behind another, roots pressed through polished imperial stone, not breaking it, learning it. Behind another, a black hall waited with a single ledger open on a table. Aren recognized the room, though he had never seen it. The first registry house. Sera Venn sat at the table, younger than the copied page, ink on her fingers, eyes lifted toward him as if the dead had better manners than the living and waited to be introduced. Her mouth moved. The corridor noise swallowed the words, but the ledger in Aren's pocket wrote them against his ribs. Don't let them call this peace. The last door didn't open. That's how Aren knew Vayrith was there. Every other domain announced itself with pressure. Fire, tide, root, memory, storm, all of them strained against the deep hinge with force an engineer could respect even while fearing it. Vayrith arrived as refusal. The central chamber dimmed, not darkened, dimmed, as if light had approached a boundary and discovered it lacked proper documents. At the heart of the deep hinge stood the receiving frame. 7 stories of chainmetal ribs, brass alignment wheels, temple bronze, bone-white registry plates, and the black stone taken from beneath the oldest death court. The frame circled nothing. Then the nothing gained edges. A door-shaped silence stood inside the machine. No handle, no hinge, no threshold line. Just the certainty of passage denied. The bound choir's voices climbed. Throat rings flashed dull silver. Imperial clerks called numbers. Engineers locked wheels. Guards pretended spears mattered. Aren stepped to his station and opened his alignment case with hands that wanted to tremble and did not. The black ledger fragment opened itself beside his tools. Ink gathered. Names appeared in columns. Kale Oris, Sera Venn, Tavern Soul, Lysa Soul, Miren Calis, Aren Calis, Civ Marat, Aren Vale. Then hundreds more, thousands, some from the past, some not yet born. The ledger was not predicting death. Aren understood that with a sickness deeper than fear. It was recording every life the chaining would make answerable to a wound they had not chosen. Aren whispered, "I'm sorry." The door-shaped silence didn't forgive him. It didn't condemn him either. That was worse. It waited. The sabotage calculations took 11 seconds. Aren saw it as cleanly as any threshold proof. If he shifted the western hinge by 9 degrees and released the lower lock before the choir reached the third binding phrase, Vayreth's pressure would tear through the death channel first. The central frame would fail. The bound domains would surge upward through unfinished passages. The gods would not be chained. Neither would the capital survive. Not possibly, not metaphorically, not in the tragic language poets could soften later. Transit arches would become open wounds. Hospitals built on rootwork would split. Fire engines would release everything they had eaten. Tide wells would invert. Death registries would lose the difference between record and command. Millions might live beyond the capital. Hundreds of thousands would die above Aren's head before dawn. The completion calculation took 9 seconds. If he held the alignment, the chaining would work. The immediate convergence would be forced below. The city would survive. The empire would declare victory. Roads, courts, wells, engines, hospitals, registries, and the thrones would continue functioning, and the wound would become structural, not a disaster, a foundation. Aren thought of Karen's saying government, Civ saying burial, Miren saying distributed, Sera saying disputed. He spent his life believing there was a correct angle if one measured carefully enough. There wasn't. There was only the angle a person could bear being responsible for. The choir reached the first binding phrase. Aren placed his hand on the western hinge control. He didn't sabotage it. He didn't obey cleanly either. Instead, he opened a maintenance path so small no imperial reviewer would see it unless they were looking with guilt. A witness route, a flaw shaped like memory. He threaded Sera's disputed page into the registry plate, Miren's report into the diagnostic channel, and his own ledger fragment into the threshold archive. The chaining would close, but it would not close perfectly. Somewhere in the future, if the right register opened the right book in the right cold hall, the wound would still know how to speak. Aren made the alteration with 3 fractions of a turn. The first fraction seated the disputed page beneath the western registry plate. The second fraction tied Miren's report to the diagnostic turn, where any future instability would echo backward through the archive path instead of vanishing into approved categories. The third fraction he saved for himself. He took out the annotation stylus, opened a blank strip of black ledger backing, and wrote the line, "We didn't bury the wound. We built the world on top of it." The stylus cracked in his hand. For one breath, every door in the deep hinge looked toward him. That was impossible, of course. Doors didn't look. Hinges didn't notice. Machines didn't judge men who calibrated them. The Empire had survived by insisting on such distinctions. Then Civ Murat's voice cut through the choir. Not loud. The throat ring wouldn't allow loud, but clear enough that Aren had heard every word. Witness laid. Passage remembers. A priest clerk struck Civ across the mouth. The choir didn't stop singing. Aren kept his eyes on the alignment wheel, because if he looked at Civ, he might choose the cleaner failure after all. Karen entered the chamber with her guard behind her. She saw Aren's hand on the wheel, saw the open ledger, saw the western plate settle 1 hair's breadth out of imperial perfection. For a heartbeat, Aren thought she would order him removed. Instead, the Empress looked at the door-shaped silence in the frame and then at the ceiling where her city waited. "Hold it," she said. Aren did. The great chaining began with bells. Not the bright bells above the Capitol, not the polished bells hung in the civic towers and rung for marriages, verdicts, market openings, plague endings, and imperial births. These were older. They rang from beneath the world where no bells had been installed. The first note closed the fire channels. Blue-white flames folded inward and became a line of heatless light running through the deep hinge. Workers cried out as forgotten faces flashed behind their eyes and vanished again. The second note pulled tide sound through the pressure wells. The stone floor rippled like dark water. Every mouth in the chamber tasted salt. The third note woke root below the foundations. Green pressure rose through cracks in the black stone, not breaking the chamber, gripping it, holding it in place the way hands hold a struggling wrist. The fourth note turned memory into script. Names blackened across brass plates faster than clerks could read. Not just names of gods, names of cities saved by stolen rain, names of children healed by root, names of soldiers carried home by death work after their deaths had been delayed for strategy. The fifth note belonged to Vayreth. It made no sound. The door-shaped silence entered every open threshold in the room. The bound choir sang the binding phrase. Some wept. Some stared forward with face emptied by discipline. Siv Marat's throat ring glowed white at the edge, but his voice remained in the shape. Aren turned the main wheel. The deep hinge answered. Doors slammed across the underworld one by one. Not wooden doors, not temple doors, the doors between prayer and extraction, gift and theft, death and command, fire and appetite, tide and pressure, root and ownership, memory and record. The Empire forced them shut and drove chains through the seams. Above, the capital survived its first breath. Below, the gods began learning the shape of a prison. When the binding ceased, the world lowered by half an inch. No instrument recorded it. No report would mention it. But everyone in the deep hinge felt the drop in their teeth, knees, and memories. The capital settled onto something alive and told itself the foundation had strengthened. The door-shaped silence folded inward. For one impossible moment, Aren stood at the edge of the last door. He saw no face, no throne, no skeleton god waiting with a crown of keys. Vayreth was not a monarch of endings. Vayreth was the law that passage was not possession, the mercy that a thing allowed to end could be released, the terror that a thing prevented from ending would find other ways to remain. The Empire had not defeated that law. It had built a city on top of its violation. Aren saw the roads laid over sleeping chains, courts where verdicts would carry faint pressure no judge understood, hospitals where saved children dreamed of roots, engines where fire remembered names, register halls where black books waited for deaths that had not happened because somewhere beneath the world the last door had been forced to stay closed. Then the vision ended. The receiving frame locked. The choir collapsed as one body held up by cords. Guards rushed forward. Clerks shouted for damage reports. Engineers began congratulating one another in shaky voices of people alive enough to mistake survival for proof. Karen stood very still. Aren looked at her for the first time. She looked old. "Is it done?" she asked. Chief Architect Volan checked the central gauge. "The gods are contained, Majesty." Contained. There it was, the first lie of a new age. Aren closed the ledger fragment before it could write what the lie would cost. At dawn, the capital celebrated peace. Banners unfurled from the high bridges. Bells rang from every tower. The official criers announced that divine instability had been contained, the gods seated safely beneath imperial protection, and the age of unmanaged miracle brought at last under lawful order. People wept in the streets. Aren could not hate them for that. They had lived through years of false miracles, failing engines, plague wards cracking from below, tidewells singing at night, death records disputing verdicts, and officials who changed vocabulary faster than the reality could object. They wanted the terror to be over. Wanting that did not make them guilty. It made them human. From the Dawn Terrace, Aren watched Karen receive the people's relief like a woman accepting a debt she knew could never be repaid. "You altered the western plate," she said without looking at him. Aren's mouth went dry. "Yes." "Will it weaken the seal?" "Not today." Karen nodded, as if it was the only answer any ruler ever truly had. Below them, a triumph arch opened for the morning procession. For half a second, black water reflected in its stones. Then only sunlight. A hospital bell rang 2 streets away, and every window in the ward flickered green, like leaves turning under the skin. A fire team passed beneath the terrace, silent and efficient, trilling the smell of a song Aren had forgotten before he could remember whose it was. At the register annex, a clerk dropped a tray of tablets and began to cry because one of them had written his daughter's name beside a date 30 years away. Small signs, manageable signs, the kind empires survived by filing separately. Karen faced the city. "They'll call this a victory," Aren said. "Yes." "What will you call it?" The Empress didn't answer for a long time. When she did, her voice was almost too soft for history. Time bought on terrible terms. Then she stepped forward to address the cheering crowd, and the official record began. Aren hid the warning where only duty would find it. Not rebellion. Rebellion was searched for. Not temple ruin. Temples were emptied. Not family rooms. Families failed, forgot, married badly, burned papers by accident, sold heirlooms when winters were thin. Duty lasted longer. 3 nights after the chaining, while the capital still celebrated and the first corrected reports moved through the ministry, Aren entered the old register route beneath the western annex. He carried a sealed case of black wood, chain metal, and ordinary clerk's wax. Inside were Sera's disputed page, Miren's report, the ledger fragment, Civ Marat's final phrase copied from memory, and Aren's annotated strip. "We didn't bury the wound. We built the world on top of it." He placed the case behind the death transfer shelf, where obsolete ledgers were routed, not destroyed. The mechanism was old, older than the Empire's current filing standards, and the old system had a mercy new systems lacked. They kept things because no one alive remembered why they mattered. Aren set the threshold path to open only under 3 conditions: a disputed death, a ruler who should be dead, a register willing to read past the authorized line. Then he added one more condition, not in numbers, but in the geometry itself: need. The route accepted it. For the first time since the chaining, the ledger fragment cooled. Aren rested his hands on the sealed case. "I'm sorry," he said, to Sera, Miren, to Civ, to the gods, to the city, to the future that would curse him if it was honest. The shelf drew the case inward. Stone closed. Aren stood alone in the dark register route and understood that witness was not absolution. It didn't wash the hands. It didn't unbuild the machine. It didn't free gods beneath the world. It only denied the Empire the comfort of being the only voice left. Some nights, that was all resistance could carry. 400 years later, in Merowyn, a sealed black ledger opened in a cold register hall. The hall had no memory of Aren Vale. Its clerks knew the Empire as old ruin, old law, old road stone under newer kingdoms. They knew the death registries as tradition. They knew the bells as civic instruments, rung for closure and coronation and plague watch. They knew the black ledger as solemn tools that sometimes behave strangely in bad weather, old buildings, or succession disputes. They didn't know about the deep hinge. They didn't know that every threshold in their city carried a fraction of a prison. They didn't know that gods under the world had been listening for 4 centuries through doors, wells, roots, fires, records, and wounds mistaken for inheritance. A young register entered before dawn with a lamp in one hand and a stack of royal notices in the other. Her name was not yet important to history, which meant history was already approaching her with bad manners. The sealed ledger on the 3rd shelf unlocked itself. She froze. The cover opened. Pages turned without wind. Ink gathered in the center of a blank sheet, black as a door with no handle. The first line wrote itself slowly. Aren Vale. The register stopped breathing. The second line appeared. King of Merowyn. A bell rang once in the tower above. The third line formed. Dead 400 years. The register backed toward the door. The 4th line wrote itself with the patience of something that had never mistaken burial for absence. Still seated. Every threshold in the hall clicked at once. The bell rang a second time. Far beneath Merowyn, far beneath Empire, far beneath the corrected records of men who had called a wound a foundation, something older than law pressed one silent hand against the dark. The last door had not opened. Not yet. But at last, someone had knocked.